Hello all. Hello to all our panelists who will now be joining us. We apologize this is not running live, but we are recording and we will create this content at the NASFiC. And with that, if all our panelists will join us. We can get started. So one of the discussions we have had amongst ourselves as we're preparing for this panel was what this panel is about. The name of the panel is about surveillance, but on the other hand, in the panel itself, in the description, it talks about AI and evil AI and truly malicious AI and devilish AI and any other thing we can create. And I was a little bit confused about that. And Nakima, for example, said that makes perfect sense to me. That's the only way it can go. And I was, wait, but surveillance is about the state. It's about criminal activity. It's about so many different things. How can it be just about this? How do we make this work together? What are we going to talk about? So before we get started and introduce everybody, I just want to fight about it. And now, of course, Nakima will step in and say, no, we're not going to fight, Gadi. We're just going to talk. Nakima, why do you see the topic to be specifically around what I call evil AI when we talk about surveillance?
I don't think evil is the term I would use, but I would say unauthorized and encroachment. And for me, those are the things that AI necessarily implies at this point in time, because AI is about pattern matching. AI is about predictive decision making, recommendations, all of which, if you add a little bit too much private information, can be encroachment, can be invasive. So it makes perfect sense to me that surveillance falls in that area.
Fair enough. Of course, we would like to get started here. If you all don't mind, I would like to turn to you to talk to me about who you are as I introduce you. So I'll start with Muhammad. Sorry, I do want to pronounce it correctly, so please give me a second. I don't want to mess it up. Muhammad I have to read this carefully. Aurangzeb, sorry for that. Muhammad Aurangzeb, thank you so much for your patience with me earlier in trying to train me to say that. We have Dr. Nakima Steffelbauer, and we have Karen Castelletti joining us today. And picking up on this fight, Muhammad, if you can maybe chime in here.
So I will actually second what Dr. Nakima just said. To that, I'll add that even if we talk in terms of AI, which is capable of doing AI, or which is capable of doing evil, you actually don't have to set out to create evil AI to actually have consequences which are negative or detrimental to society. So, for example, you don't have to be part of the League of Evil Software Engineers to create systems which discriminate against people. So there are multiple instances I've seen even in my work where even say you treat data, especially data that has anything to do with the human, with the social world. If you treat that as neutral, then you can end up with system which even though that's not your aim, can end up discriminating against people and adversely affecting their lives. So I'd agree with that characterization that Nakima made.
Okay, and this is probably the last time in this panel we'll do the roundtable thing, but I would like to complete it. Karen, what do you think?
Hi, yes, I'm Karen Castelletti. I am, just to frame it, I'm a software engineer, but I don't work specifically on AI. I've taken some AI classes and I've been adjacent to AI projects. And the biggest, I actually want to pick up on the word malicious that you used, Gadi, where I don't think that these systems are simply not as good as we think they are. They're not a magical piece of perfect technology. In many cases, they outperform humans in the same way computers can outperform humans, but in judgment and holistic thinking, they frankly underperform humans. And I think that the biggest risk from AI comes very much from what we entrust it with and what responsibilities we hand to it, and the fact that these algorithms are often poorly explainable. When they do make a certain decision, it's hard to actually go back and say, in the way you could with even a normal algorithm, well, it made this systemic incorrect decision, I'll just fix that misunderstanding it had. It's hard to understand and correct. And therefore, I think that it's very difficult when, you know, policymakers and such are not deeply technical to understand what the right and appropriate decisions are to hand to this sort of technology, and really what the downside is. You know, what is the false negative or false positive consequence.
I think I can take away from this that I attributed malice, meaning intent, to AI. When it comes down to it, what I'm hearing, it's about humans. It's about what we put into it. And maybe that is the right way of looking at it, and maybe not. But Mohammed, looking at our discussions earlier, you took AI through a positive approach. It was also human. To give a little bit of background into this, you often talk about how science fiction anticipated the future, near future technologies, and specifically, of course, its impact on society. And given the rapid adoption of AI in the last few years, you often mentioned that science fiction is having difficulty, with a few notable exceptions. And I wanted to kind of turn to you and your personal story around AI and your father. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Sure. So let me first address the first part of the question, that science fiction is having difficulty predicting the near future. So if you take a historical trajectory of sci-fi throughout the 20th century, then I would say that overall sci-fi was pretty good in anticipating the future trends and how society was evolving, versus what we look at right now, that how AI technologies like AI are rapidly changing society and how things are changing. That many of the problems that we are encountering in, let's say, people who are working within AI research, the sci-fi is actually not talking about these issues as much as it should. So, for example, problems related to, say, fairness, discrimination against, say, minority groups or other groups who are disadvantaged. And so, imagining worlds where we have solutions to these problems. So, I'm not seeing enough of that. So that was the first part. The second part, so the project that you just alluded to. So my father, he passed away 7 years ago, approximately 7 years ago. So at that time, I didn't have any kids. I wasn't even married. But when he passed away, one thing that I said to myself was that that when I was growing up, I didn't really have much experience of interacting with my grandparents because they passed away before I was 5. But I could use technology in some way or another to at least create a simulation of my father. So specifically, I created this AI machine learning system, still in a process of development, which can emulate how my father talks like, or the responses of the system is very similar to how my father would respond to certain situations. So the idea is that to give a chance for my children, so the elder one is going to turn 5, for example, pretty soon, so that she can interact with the system and have that experience of interacting with her grandfather.
That is indeed interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. It's like you build science fiction into your life. With that, I would like to turn over to the good doctor, as we would say in Star Trek, and go a little bit into your background. You have done quite a bit. You call yourself on Twitter Black Girl in Berlin Tech, right? But you've dealt with algorithmic equity and advocacy as well. You're CEO of a computer programming NGO, a Frauenloop. How do you pronounce it, please?
Frauenloop. That's it.
Perfect. And you also co-lead the Tech in Color initiative across the EU. You work with the EU Parliament. And I understand you have recently been, forgive me for going far here, but a victim of AI in a way in the banking system.
Yes. So that's an interesting story. I actually spoke about that in a hearing about algorithmic discrimination in the EU Parliament, which was basically referring to very unexpected but welcome pre-approved offer that I got a few years back from a bank, very well-known bank that shall remain unnamed, that I had been a client of for better than 20 years. And so this bank sent me a pre-approved credit offer saying, you're such a great client. We'd love for you to have this up to X amount pre-approved loan. Just tell us when you want it. We'll issue whatever we need to. Looking forward to having you on board in this program. When I signed up for it, they said, great, fill out a few questions, really just identification questions, because we've already vetted you. We already know we want to give you this credit, and take a selfie. And I was surprised because I'm no longer living in the United States, where perhaps this has become the norm. It certainly isn't within Europe. So I took the selfie. I sent in a form of federally issued identification, either my driver license or passport. I think I sent both because I already was starting to think, why would they need a selfie? Who would be looking at this selfie? Seems like it's probably an automated situation. So let me send multiple instances where these can be compared, because I know this software frequently works poorly or doesn't work at all on darker skinned persons and women in particular. Sure enough, I send the photos, I send my, enthusiastic acceptance of this offer. And every interaction after that I had with this bank was with the fraud department. Every interaction after that was basically someone in the fraud department saying, we don't know who you are, we can't identify you, and we don't know why. And we're not sure what went wrong, but we don't have the authority to look into your account, and your data is held privately somewhere, and you can't access this pre-approved offer anymore because something with the selfie and the IDs is wrong. And I thought that was a perfect example of how, as others have said, nobody is against the advance of computer vision, facial recognition, speeding up and optimizing the process of identifying and getting access to different products and services for the public. What we object to is rolling out products and programs at scale that no one on the administrative side either understands or can mitigate when something goes wrong. Because clearly this sounds like a situation where something went wrong. So my question was, how come no one in a position of reviewing the application could intervene? How come this was left up to some algorithm that no one understood enough to say, oh, hey, there's a problem? Or how many other women, how many other persons of darker complexion had this happen to them? These are questions that I asked since, and I never got the loan.
Well, that sucks. I mean, thank you for sharing that with us, first of all. It's important. We've kind of covered a little bit about complexities as well as positives of what can be done with Muhammad. We've also gone, thanks to you, into the challenges society faces, which I believe is where, personal opinion, science fiction is kind of shifting toward, more around how small changes in how this affects our current society in the future. Science fiction is all about society. I'm just looking at things people write right now, and it seems to be more about rights and freedom and different ideologies surrounding, I guess, even colonialism. And that is something that I take from your words beyond what you just said, but I'm not saying that is what you said, of course. And I would like to turn to Karen to bring in another perspective. I have a friend, not Karen, although she's also my friend, who has often talked to me about her startup in recruitment and HR, where they use AI, machine learning, of course, all the time. And they try to take into consideration ethics and how they can make sure that biases do not go in there and influence poorly the choices that the algorithm makes. And she told me of being on a panel where other CEOs have been on, about 4 or 5 of them, and they all said, no, that's not our problem. This is not something we should deal with. Our job is to get the business up and running. We're a startup. And I can fully understand them. It still bothers me. And Karen has a story about her advising a friend on actually starting to use AI technology in their own startup in the medical space. Karen, maybe you can share a little bit of that with us. And then we'll go to Dragos.
Yeah, there are a lot of words in what you said that I find myself just sort of saying yes to, and one of them is fraud. That like both two points I want to pick up. One is about where these systems seem to be the most popular in detecting fraud, And I understand the idea in that fraud is looking for anomalies effectively in a large data set. So great, I understand the temptation. Fraud is also, and being identified as fraud and finding fraud is, of course, also a place where systemic, biases and real consequences are, affect real people. And also sort of the split between the people who build these systems and then the people who ultimately are implementing or proctoring them, or are the, go on to make the decisions to use them in a business. So the friend of mine, and I'll keep it a bit vague because I don't think he took my advice, wanted to start a company that would find medical fraud. And the idea that at least in the US, the healthcare system, one of its main problems is that it pays out too many fraudulent claims. Now, I think I'm perfectly willing to believe that that is a problem of the healthcare system. I am not convinced that is the primary problem of the US healthcare system, but and he was asking about using AI to do this. And it was clear that both I and the other engineer he was talking to were pretty uncomfortable with the idea. And the reason is that I just my mind immediately went to how can this be used wrong? So you're midway through, frankly, an anomalous event in your own life. You have been diagnosed with some serious illness and you're trying to access treatment quickly, or, a really, sensitive treatment that has to happen quickly. And all the ways that you could inadvertently trigger this fraud detection where suddenly your treatment stops being paid for or is just interrupted. An interrupted treatment or sounds innocent enough if it's not a heart surgery that you need quickly. And I'm also imagining this person who's trying to convince a system that they are not fraudulent, but that they actually need the surgery. They're probably in the weakest position of their life. They're as physically ill as they've ever been. And I was listening to this cool idea, and there were chills sort of creeping up me. And I was like, it's hard for me to see how this isn't going to kill somebody, just actually kill somebody. And, once you build it, you're not really going to have control over how people use it. And, it will be out of your hands. You won't know if you succeed, you will not know everybody who implements this. And so if you're going to go ahead and do it, I at least, I ask you, please consider this now. Please talk about this all the time to everybody you pitch it to, and, do whatever you can to shepherd it as you bring it into the world. At MIT graduation, there were folks coming around with a pledge saying, we want to get graduating seniors to sign this pledge. And the pledge was, I will think about the ethical impacts of my work. And at 21, that request actually surprised me. And I don't think I was very thoughtful about it. I was very much, it was really the first time I'd thought outside of the mindset of I will build cool things and then people will decide how to use them. And thought, maybe there's more I need to do. And I realized then that one of the companies I'd interviewed with that had a really cool large scale people simulator that would figure out in a disaster, well, the moms are going to go to all the parents will go to the school first before they evacuate. I was like, wow, that could really help people. I went back and I looked and I was like, oh, this is a defense contractor. And it added a whole new way of thinking about work and what you choose to work on. And I don't know, I'm excited to talk about this with this group.
I think we have a lot to talk about it on this panel. What seems obvious to me is we're not talking about live thinking androids or systems here. We're talking about human society as it is today and what could happen around that. And there is also, as we said, the human factor. And while there is a lot of bias, and I would love to hear you speak about bias, it seems to be a common topic, I want to turn to Dragos and specifically ask him about, unless of course he's busy with, he will tell us in a second, with making all these streaming things work, because that's another thing he's helping us with right now and he'll tell me in a second. What about being malicious? What about doing this on purpose? Dragos is in security and he has a lot of experience with that. Dragos, please go ahead if you can.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, actually, I am busy right now, but because the auditorium stream right now has completely
We appreciate
fallen
you
over
helping
and
with all of
exploded.
that. Don't worry about it. Go make sure the streams work and the
But
convention
no,
works.
let me inject a little example that I've kind of kept in my back pocket for this stuff, because I think that malicious applications of some of this technologies is a very it's a growth business in this area. I was going to have this example for this panel because one of the interesting things I saw last week was there was one of the announcements for the Biden campaign. This is not political, by the way. Um, they had a song was posted on a video for, I think it was Bruce Springsteen or somebody fairly famous that was there, and it was flagged in Facebook as a misrepresentation of COVID information by the Facebook bots. Somebody had submitted enough requests in, and they'd actually managed to get one of those overlays on the song video of this, which had nothing to do with COVID. So it's very interesting that a lot of these technologies, if they have malicious applications that are possible with them, and I think that we're just beginning to learn exactly where these automations and this internet stuff is going in terms of evil applications for it. So with that, I'll let you guys talk about it, but if it's okay, I'm going to go back and figure out why the auditorium stream is blowing up and why those guys are kind of going right now.
Go.
Bear with
Thank
me
you
for a second
contributing,
here.
though.
I apologize. Leave that
Go.
example for you guys, and yes, bye.
We don't like you. No, I'm kidding. Just go.
For a guy with a black hat talking about evil AI, you're very helpful. Thank you for keeping us up and running.
Anyway, there are a lot of directions we can go, but I would like to make a couple of observations. One of them is we are all very negative, or maybe realists. I don't want to speak for you. From my perspective, even if we spoke about things that were positive and optimistic, we are, except for maybe Muhammad's example, we are showing examples of where things could go wrong. As a security person, for me, that is very valuable. That's the way I usually go. Red teaming, trying to find the problems. On the other hand, all these algorithms and all these technologies help people, help society. We move forward, maybe not in the right way, maybe not without problems and growth pains, but can we look at these pains in growth rather than as inherent problems, or these two things mutually exclusive? How do we even start to look at this? And maybe the good doctor, if you're not offended by me calling you that, can start us off on that.
That's actually the first time that I've gotten that repeatedly, so I'm fine with it.
Okay, I'll keep doing that. I hope it doesn't get annoying. If it does, let me know.
I wanted to put in or posit the idea that the inherent promise of AI, if you go to Minority Report and all of these kinds of hyped up presentations of artificial intelligence, is that everything is optimized, everything is automated, everything can be done devoid or distanced from human bias and human subjectivity. And so there's a hope, at least, that you'll have a much more clinical, a much more scientific, and a much more fair application of whatever the product, service, or procedure is if you put it in the hands of an algorithm. And the difficulty, I think, with all of these, whether we're talking about healthcare applications or in employment or crime prevention, any of these various areas, is that AI is based on machine learning, which is based on historical data, which means regardless of how we bake it or clean it or standardize or transform this data, it is the past. So if we're talking about a future that we're imagining with all these cool things and all these cool procedures optimized by algorithms that run 1 billion times faster than our human brains can calculate them, we're still not addressing the fact that all of these calculations are based on the past human society, which is full of bias and flaws and things that we would love to correct for, but we maybe don't do that when we're optimizing these algorithms that are just trying to draw from the data that exists from the past.
I would like to ask Muhammad to actually step in here. I think I don't even need to moderate.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, to that, I'll add that. So there is actually even terminology for this, that a society run by algorithms. So fair enough, it's algocracy. So it's a discussion which is going on in the research community right now. And then so first, let me talk about the positives. So one is that, so Nakima is absolutely correct that one limitation is that these models are built upon historical retrospective data. And we can only guess at what prospective data might look like. So within the research community, people are working towards counterfactual models where you try to simulate if, say, certain policy was adopted, how the society or how the world will look like. So there's some I would say recognition towards that effect. The other thing is that the problems of technology more often than not are not solely problems of technology. So just the fact that we can devise these algorithms to make our lives easier in decision making. There's should always be an element of human in the loop, just to catch these anomalous events, and just also to link the example that Karen gave about her friend and Dr. Nakima's personal experience. So it's a couple of years ago in Idaho, there was a well-known case where people with disabilities were being denied benefits. So their benefits were being reduced by $20,000 every year. And they could not figure out why this was happening. So they would go and talk to the state officials, and then they would say, well, we just cannot tell you because it's private data. So ACLU stepped in, and they filed a case against the state government, and they had to disclose what was going on. And sure enough, it was actually a black box algorithm which was making these decisions regarding these people with disabilities. And it was thinking that, quote unquote, it was thinking that these benefits should be reduced year after year. So again, it's not that it's an evil software engineer is making, or a group of them are making these decisions. It's that because there's no human in the loop, or we trust these systems too much, where these things are happening.
So we actually have a question from the audience. And I love questions from the audience. Lisa asks, AI saves repetitive human effort. Theoretically, this is a good thing, question mark. Who wants to take a stab at that?
I mean, I can
take that.
Karen.
Karen.
Nakima spoke first, I think, so please go ahead. Karen next.
Well, I would say that it absolutely can save human effort, and the optimization factor means much quicker and more efficient processing of data. That's great when the outcomes are as expected and the outcomes are predictable and fair. The problem is when you have outcomes that are neither predictable nor fair, and I'll give a good real life example, such as the UK passport overhaul. The UK passports were redone within the last year to allow for facial recognition to be possible with the chips that they put into the new British passports. These work poorly to not at all on darker skinned British citizens. But the British government was so excited to digitalize because there's sort of an arms race happening in Europe in terms of trying to become the next Estonia and have e-everything. And so they rolled it out anyway. And they rolled it out anyway because then they were able to say, look how efficient our public administration of nationality and passport documents and identity data is. But they didn't calculate the costs of all the lawsuits and all of the challenges legally that they would have of all of the darker skinned British citizens who would then have hassles at the borders, have hassles trying to enter and leave the country when their passports couldn't be read properly because the scanners that would go with the chips and the photographic information for the passports didn't function properly. Same thing for registering for official British documents on the uk.gov website. Didn't work very well. Employees of the administration knew this, didn't find a solution, rolled it out anyway. So I think you have to always balance this incredible leap of productivity and optimization and money saving that is promised with most algorithmic implementations with what actually happens when it goes wrong and who's going to bear the costs of that.
At this stage, we're 15 minutes out, so I would like to turn into what I see you, Karen, into what I call the turbo round. And I will not be as rude as to tell you, speak faster, but speak faster. Karen, go ahead, please.
Nikiba, you talked about these systems being predictable and fair. And I want to pull in the point earlier that I'd mentioned the word explainability. This is hard. Like, we're building these systems is hard. Like, I think, where we could lower the bar even, I think if they were explainable and correctable, that would be, we could move forward from there. Mohammed mentioned that data privacy laws, which is, I think, another factor of this. If the data they're chewing over is data you can't see, how can you possibly, explainability and correctability is so far away if you're not even allowed to see the input. Someone mentioned the phrase "garbage in, garbage out" is a nice mantra of this field. But we also wouldn't have anything to gang up on, which when Gadi had suggested this panel, I was like, Gadi, I'm an AI curmudgeon. I don't know if you want me on this panel with people who are really excited about AI. And so I'm pleasantly surprised to see it's been a bit the opposite. And so I want to kind of pull the idea that, like, there wouldn't be anything for us to gang up on if the potential of AI was not really high, and people didn't obviously recognize that. And I think that we talk about time savings. It's not just saving time, that it would take a human longer to do something, but AI can actually help us find solutions and options that we couldn't find at all otherwise. An application of AI also in the medical field that I think is really amazing. I also know some people who are using it to discover new, drug compounds that they could potentially test to use against different diseases, and being able to run, many more simulations that we couldn't even, not just, the promise of computers is you can do many things quickly, but it's actually coming up with ideas of things to combine that we couldn't otherwise, or conditions to test them under. And I think that's a case where humans are going to look at the output before actually creating it and putting it in human bodies. And so I think that's an example of kind of the right, a good positive application of this technology, where there are enough humans in the loop who understand the data that they can apply some sanity testing before they go poison people.
So at this stage, I'm facing a challenge as a moderator. Do we also include some other aspects of this discussion, trying to not be as curmudgeon-y, or do we double down? And honestly, I think we should adopt and adapt to our current mood and double down. I'm a security guy, cybersecurity, and for me, I shifted in the last few years from complaining and whining to saying, how does this actually work? Kind of trying to do the psychohistory thing, the economics thing, and consistently noticing people will not work on a problem before it is cost enough. They will not spend time on it. They will not even think about it. They will shut you down for being in their way. Even if they think about the security, which they won't necessarily, right? Because they're busy getting things working and working 18-hour days. They will not have the resources to get it done. They need to survive in the market. Now, it's not an excuse for getting things wrong, but is there something we can do to shift our people work around these developments, to shift how these projects work, maybe from a governmental, I can't believe I'm saying this, regulatory perspective? I don't like that much regulation around technology. So what do you guys think? What can we do around this? And be curmudgeon-y as you like.
I think explainability is the key. Karen's point is 100% well taken, because what we don't want is the situation that you have, for instance, right now with the British A-levels, the international baccalaureate school leaving exams, where because of COVID, all of these schools have decided to cancel final high school leaving exams, and then they've turned to outsourced business partners to develop algorithms, which in many cases were based on historical data about historical performance of other students on final exams to generate the final exam results for today's students, for this year's class. And now that there's massive protests because, in the UK, all of the private schools, the Etons, the Harrows, have not seen their scores downgraded, but many of the lower income and public schools across the UK have seen their students' scores downgraded, and no one can explain. This is the key, how can it be that you're putting really important decisions in that heavily impact humans in the hands of some company running an algorithm that they're under no obligation to explain or to be able to explain?
Karen seems to be excited about what you're saying, Dr. Nakima.
Oh, I liked the word obligation that came up. Because Gadi, you talked about, how can regulation be part of this? And I think that they're really, in pushing my friends, stay involved with the applications of your system. And, I'm telling you this before you've even started to code, because I want this to be something you think about from the beginning. Like, I don't think that the end users of a system that gets popular can really play this role. And it's not just because of access or lack of access to data, that's a different, regulatory issue, but because they're very difficult. Like it does require a lot of specialization to be able to go in and correct one of these systems. And so I really think that there needs to be a burden on the people who create it and put it forward to say, you can't use this if it is exhibiting X, Y, or Z problems. And, I am not able to license it to you to use it that way. We've tracked it. It's causing this systemic harm, and I either need to fix it, or you're not allowed to use it in this way anymore. Google. I've recently been running. I work in healthcare. Google has outsourced its ability to understand if you are serving ads for medical terms, to try to understand whether Google's not in the medical space. They don't understand who's a real pharmacy, real serving COVID, data or not. And so they outsource it to a third party, and they say, we're going to use this third party to figure out whether you should be allowed to serve these ads or not. And they're I've seen them, like, they're blocking us, inaccurately, and we've had to appeal it. I don't mind at all. I think that's entirely fair. I want them to not let me sell medical things to people if they're not sure that it's real. And it's, very much the burden is now back on, I'm not allowed to use this technology if they're not sure. I think that is actually a good policy, and I'd like to see that implemented at the governmental level more.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so to that, I'll add that, so my academic research is actually on explainability and fairness in healthcare AI. And yeah, so all of the things that, so those are perfectly valid. But there's also a technical challenge, which is that there are also models which are extremely complex, that it's not even possible for people who created these models to understand what's going on. To give you an example, so some image recognition systems that Google uses, it has more than 5 billion parameters. It would be safe to say that nobody understands how these models are working. So if you cannot understand how those models are working, then how can you even debug them? That said, one way to do that without explainability is that to take what at least I like to call the mechanics perspective. If you think about, so I'll give my example. So I don't know much about cars. I just know how to drive them. That's it. So if my car breaks down, then I would not know anything to do about it. If you think about mechanics, then majority of the mechanics in the world, because majority of people live in developing countries, are actually illiterate. So they don't have degrees in engineering, or a lot of them don't even know how to read or write. But if your car breaks down, then you go to the mechanic and they just tell you, they will still be able to fix it. So you don't go and ask the mechanic, oh, do you know the second law of thermodynamics? That wouldn't make sense. So we can adopt the same perspective, which is that be able to debug in the sense that given these particular inputs, what are the outputs? So that's one way to think about it. And then in the interest of time, I'll just say that the regulation is the way to go. One problem is that the regulatory bodies, a lot of people, they're not well educated with respect to the current state of the art in AI. And secondly, the field is advancing so rapidly that it's extremely difficult for even practitioners to keep up.
Nakima?
I wanted to add
Dr.
one last point, which was around the facial recognition technologies that now Amazon, IBM, and Microsoft have stopped or paused selling to law enforcement for that very reason, because they don't have any effective enforcement of the standards that they would like for law enforcement departments to use with regard to matching faces to databases. They've said that it needs to be, in order to take a photo, find it in their database, and accuse someone of a crime, there needs to be at least a 90 or 88% accuracy match, confidence match. And in fact, many police departments are looking up, the girlfriends or the associates or whatever of their personal lives with 33% or 32 or 25% confidence in the match, and then off they go to arrest people. And so if you don't have any oversight from the companies that are selling this software to different entities, and the government is even more in the dark because the government officials have even less information about how facial recognition or any machine learning algorithms work, then you have to really think about whether it's time to roll this out at scale or not, or pause it.
I think that what Dr. Nakima is saying is super critical. And I would like to challenge the panel by saying, can we wait for the government? Policymakers, lawyers, very conservative people, not talking politically. It's about not creating change. It's about, having looked at cybersecurity and technology the last 20 years and more, they will follow and they will help once it's done and hopefully do it correctly, or it will be corrected 20 years later after that and 20 years after that. Beyond education, which is what I call terminology that didn't be used, being not an expert in the field, and beyond waiting for the government or other bodies such as commercial entities to make us do things, is there something else we can do on this? And I'm actually going to turn to Dragos because he has had enough time to create his titling. Therefore, I know that he has some time for us. Dragos, please unmute yourself, sir.
Absolutely. So the problems with the streams are now out of my domain. Now my stuff's working. I think that you're absolutely right, Gadi. I mean, most of the policies are going to be about resisting the change, and I don't know that I don't know that we've actually thought about all the implications. The one maxim that I truly believe in is that humans tend to overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term impact of any new technology. As we always think that things will change much more quickly than they do, and then in the end, things change much more dramatically than we'd ever predicted what they're going to do. I mean, specifically in this area of facial recognition, everybody's wondering, well, what do we do? What do we do? Should we adopt this? I think in some ways it's inevitable. The question that we haven't thought about is what happens after we've adopted it. And consider what the point is. We become dependent on facial ID, for instance. We become so accustomed to the fact that you can see this little box that I have turned on here. That's a face recognition software. It's done by a little chip in my camera. And if I do this, it turns off. And the computers don't pick that up anymore. What are the corner cases where that stuff will fail? We haven't thought through. Particularly, consider this scenario. We start using for facial recognition for law enforcement. Whether or not people decide to sell it or not. Eventually,
so
somebody's going to try
Dragos, I'm really
this.
sorry for doing this, but we are running out of time. And before we go into another example, I'm really glad you got to speak a little bit to bring the technical thing in here. I would like to turn over to Mohammed to see if he can summarize this for us or bring us some sort of insight from academia, perhaps, or from personal life with his own project.
So I would say that the problem with AI being malicious is not that AI is intelligent. The problem is that AI will be misapplied, and it is being misapplied. That it's not artificial intelligence, but artificial stupidity that we should be worried about in the short term and also in the long run. That we turn over our autonomy to these systems.
All right. Well, I really appreciate that, Dr. Nakima, Karen, Dragos.
I think ethical impacts is really important, and I really am happy that most of the panelists agreed.
All right, then. Well, you all came in and helped us out. I think this was a truly interesting discussion. And I hope we'll have more discussions that are similar in the future. And with that, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and everybody who sent us questions. Lisa, and I hope we'll continue the discussion in the future.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.